The annual State of States report assessing and ranking the fiscal performance of all of Nigeria's 36 states from the most sustainable to the least was recently released. The report showed that the total internally generated revenue, IGR, of the 36 states grew by 12.98% to 1.82 trillion naira in 2022 from 1.61 trillion naira in 2021. But this growth was not seen across board. And the report also raised questions about the viability of many of Nigeria's states, as well as pushing for the right reforms to be put in place. And as there is a national conversation on debt, the State of States report showed that there also needs to be a subnational focus on states' debt. Iniobong Usen, Head Research and Policy Advisory for BudgIT, which puts out the annual report, joins me now. Iniobong, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, good morning, Tolu, and thanks for having me.
So there are a lot of numbers to unpack in this conversation. It's almost even difficult to decide where to start from. But I'll start from where my intro ended, which is around the conversation about subnational debt. Now, BudgIT found that total debt of the 36 states increased by 13.89% from some 6.37 trillion in 2021 to 7.25 trillion in 2022. 5 states, that's Plateau, Bayelsa, Imo, Katsina, and Rivers, recorded a decline in their total debt stock. But we also saw Lagos, Kaduna, Edo, and Cross River, who have dollar-denominated debts of over $250 million. And Lagos, I don't think this is a shocker to anybody, Lagos's foreign debt stock of $1.25 billion surpassed the cumulative foreign debt stock of 24 states as of the 31st of December 2022. So let's start from there. What kind of picture are we seeing? What does this paint for us in terms of the viability and the volatility that's associated with debts at the subnational level?
Yeah, thanks, Tolu, once again. I mean, with the debt sustainability of the states, I would like the focus this time around to be on foreign debt. As we've seen with the slump in the naira, in the value of the naira against the dollar, for a state like Lagos, without acquiring, an additional dollar-denominated debt, we saw that just by mere fact that the rates increased from 440 naira to $1 to 771 naira to $1, the foreign debt increased by over 300 billion. Now, looking at the rate at in the I&E window today, which is at about 831 naira, that tells you that without Lagos State even getting any additional foreign denominated debt or dollar denominated debt, as the case may be, the amount of naira that Lagos would need to purchase the dollar to repay back that debt has also further increased. And that, sort of tells you how vulnerable the states with huge dollar-denominated debt profiles are to exchange rate volatility. And so states need to begin to check their appetite for acquiring or accumulating, dollar-denominated debts that have, relatively high interest rates.
So in this conversation, as it is at the national level and subnational level, it's always about what the loans or what the debt is being taken for. So when we look at it at a state level, we know there's a deficit in infrastructure, in healthcare, in education, both national and subnational level. But when we look at it with the states, are we seeing that being replicated as well? So using Lagos, for example, again, what is Lagos taking this massive amount of debt for? Is it something in the long run that's going to be sustainable and be able to pay at least some parts of the debt off by itself?
So for some states like Lagos, Kaduna, Rivers, that are prioritizing, a large chunk of their budget on capital expenditure, which is usually geared towards addressing this infrastructure deficit or gap, as the case may be. But the case is different for a lot more states. So a state like Bayelsa, is heavy on recurrent. So things around payment of salaries, overheads, and the interest on some of the loans that they have accumulated over time forms a large chunk of their spending in that particular year. Looking at what transpired in 2022, about 13 states grew their overhead expenditure by more than 40%. And for a state like Cross River, it grew its overhead cost by more than 100%. And this sort of points to what the states are doing with regards to reducing the cost of governance. A large component, of the cost of governance is usually the overhead costs. And so for states to be able to, invest a lot more on, capital expenditure, which looks at, infrastructure around health, education, roads, that impacts the ease of doing business greatly. It would mean that states will need to create a fiscal space by reducing a chunk of what they spend on overheads, and also ensure that even for capex, it's focused on developmental projects. It's focused on sectors that can stimulate economic growth in those states, for the states over time to be able to raise enough revenues to pay back such debt.
Okay, so let's look at the IGR sort of aspect of this conversation, because on the flip side, we saw IGR of the 36 states grow by 12.98% to 1.82 trillion in 2022, and that seemed to be, of course, a positive thing. The cumulative revenue of the 36 states grew by some 28.95% from 5.12 trillion in 2021 to 6.6 trillion in 2022, indicating a strengthened domestic revenue mobilization capability. If we put the debt conversation side by side, the IGR conversation, is there really a cause to worry? And I'll say that knowing that my next question does take into cognizance the fact that the IGR increase was not reflective across board, and there are some 17 states that actually experienced a decline in their IGR.
So it's important to situate this conversation around the IGR growth within, also the context of federal or the dependence on federal transfers. So even if the total revenue grew year on year, we saw that the growth in transfers from the federal government through FAC, whether it's statutory allocation or the VAT, or for states that benefit from the 13% derivation, that the growth in those federal transfers, was relatively more than the growth in IGR. And so even if there was an increase in IGR year on year, the dependence on federal transfers, seemed to have increased from last year to about 64%. So 64% of the cumulative revenues of the 36 states were federal transfers. And we saw that 32 states, 50% of the total revenues for 32 states were made up of federal transfers, while for about, I think, 16 states, 70%, over 70% of their total revenues were from federal transfers. So that tells you that the states are not really doing well if you look at them cumulatively. Some states, like Kaduna, like Lagos, like Rivers, are doing relatively better than some other states in terms of the ability to mobilize revenues internally and win themselves off transfers from the federal government. And there are a number of reasons why states have not been able to, do that over time. If you look at components of what would usually make up their IGR, for a lot of the states, they still get a lot of their tax revenues as personal income taxes, or payee, as they would like to call it. So they have not been able to diversify the tax base, such that for areas like road taxes, direct assessment that looks at what's coming in from the informal sector, from entrepreneurs, even if there's testament to the fact that citizens are paying a lot in, whether you call them taxes, levies, or nuisance levies, as the case may be, there's still some entity in the middle that is taking these revenues and not remitting into the coffers of the states. So states need to really reform their tax regime to ensure that whatever is leaving the pocket of, whether it's an individual or a small business as tax, finds its way into the coffers of the state, so that state can now use these revenues to implement programs and projects across board that would benefit both individuals and businesses, residents in that state.
Okay, so we'll come back to the tax conversation, or particularly the reforms, but I want to focus on this because this IGR conversation is quite interesting. So 19 states recorded positive growth. 17 states were the ones that had the issues and actually showed a decline. Not that they stayed relative to the rankings from the previous year, but they actually declined. And that's just one state short of being half of Nigeria's total federation. When we look at those 17 states that showed a decline, was there any commonality or similarity in the issues that affected them in terms of their IGR?
So for a number of states, we saw that across board, for things like sales, that they would often get as part of their revenues, some other entries from fees, for even some for payee, we saw that it declined year on year for some states. And so part of the post-engagement strategy for the state of states is to really investigate why, for some states, we saw that there were collections, there was higher collections in terms of taxes, even in the COVID year, than in 2022, where recovery, has happened and economic activities have sort of sprouted relative to 2020. And so moving forward, part of the strategy post the launch of State of States is to investigate, on a state-by-state basis, what the drivers for that drop in the IGR for across those different components, and for states that had relatively increased, what the drivers were, and so that we can promote peer learning across board, so that states can learn from other states in areas where they are really doing well, as the case may be.
All right, so let's get back to that tax conversation, because one thing that the report noted is that the states do need to implement reforms to strengthen their tax mobilization capacity. You've talked about diversifying and, of course, widening the tax base. But how do we do these reforms? I'm quite interested in that, and I know a number of Nigerians would be. When you have an overburdened populace that has faced and is facing extremely difficult economic situations right now. You made mention of the rate of the naira to the dollar at the INE window yesterday, closing at over 1,200 and something to $1. We've just seen the lifting of the forex ban on 43 items. That's going to add more pressure there. And even though we've heard from the CBN governor that he's anticipating clearing the forex backlog of about $10 million in the next few weeks, we know that things are very, very difficult right now. Taxes are the last thing any Nigerian wants to hear. But also yesterday, we saw from the chairman of the Presidential Tax Reform Committee that they've submitted their report. They want to move 60 both national and state taxes down to less than 10. So beyond just tax reform, what other reforms do we need to see the states get involved in?
I mean, we need to look at the ease of doing business. If you look at certain areas that make doing business difficult in Nigeria, I would just even look at road transport. 2 weeks ago, I saw like a clip where a trailer carrying food from up north somewhere down to the south, carrying perishable products, fell off on the road, and the products the produce that trailer was carrying, you got bad in the process of that. And we see that for people who do businesses across board, these are challenges that they face, from the debt in road infrastructure to power. For a lot of businesses, they spend a large chunk of their operating expenses on generating energy to power their businesses, whether it's the barber, whether it's the tailor. I mean, looking at also the cost of purchasing fuel these days, you see that cost for energy has considerably increased in those states. If you look at taxes across board, the multiplicity of taxes. Also, I saw a clip where somebody transporting agricultural produce from the north down south had to pay for 77 stickers. Now, you would expect that cost, by the time that produce gets to the market somewhere in Lagos for somebody to purchase, that cost would have been transferred to the final consumer. And, these are things that contribute largely to the inflation around food. Also, we've seen that we've not been able to attain food security, especially due to insecurity around the areas, that produce food for the country. And so the government, whether at the state level or at the federal level, need to come together to, implement reforms around improvement in road infrastructure, improvement in transport infrastructure, improvement in security, improvement in power, and also the reforms that have started also around the harmonization of taxes, that has been put forward by the Taiwo Oyedele Tax Committee, needs to be sort of quickened, so that across board, persons who do business know exactly what it is they are supposed to pay as taxes, and are able to properly factor that into their costs. One thing that states and also at the federal government level needs to happen is that there needs to be very, very, very stringent consequence management regime in place. The state cannot afford the quantum of corruption that happens across board, at the moment. We need to be able to, rein in persons who have taken advantage of the state, stolen from the state revenues that are supposed to find their ways into the general coffers for government to implement those projects. These are things that states need to really take seriously at the moment and rein these people in, so that we're able to mobilize revenues more effectively across board to be able to implement these very important programs. Also, states also now need to prioritize investments in healthcare, in education, because studies have shown that for countries that have better educational or health outcomes, those countries eventually, have better economic growth, as the case may be. So there's a direct or a strong correlation between improvements in healthcare, in education, and economic growth.
Okay, so let's talk about one state that seems to be doing a bit better than others, and that's Ogun State, which beat other states to emerge as Nigeria's most improved state and was closely followed by Kaduna, Bauchi, and Rivers State in your latest ranking. Now, Ogun State, which has in the last 4 years remained among Nigeria's top 4 IGR states, coming behind Lagos, Rivers, and the FCT, has now taken the lead in percentage of IGR growth. So what is Ogun State doing right that we might be able to see other states replicating? And even the governor has been very, very proud of seeing Ogun State at the top of this list from BudgIT.
So, I think Ogun State is beginning to understand the benefit it has being, in close proximity to Lagos.
Yes.
There are a lot of industrial activities, happening in Ogun State, and, the closeness also to the ports. And in previous reports of the state of states, we had, harped on states like Ogun that are really close to Lagos State, to develop whether it's infrastructure around housing, because that housing in Lagos is, quite expensive, relatively expensive to Ogun State. So if infrastructure in towns very close to Lagos is brought up to, par, people can live in Ogun State, pay taxes in Ogun State, and also work in Lagos. Same thing with, you have with a lot of the industries setting up in Ogun State in that regard as well. So we are beginning to see that Ogun State is trying to woo investors, from Lagos State, to Ogun State by the mere fact that it's very proximate to Lagos State. And, some of those gains are beginning to show in their fiscal statements as the case may be.
So were there any bright spots in the report that would probably put people at ease when it comes to the financial sustainability or viability of Nigerian states? Or is it really not necessarily red flags, but areas for cause of concerns? Do we have particular states we need to keep our eyes peeled to, particularly when it comes to financial sustainability, I beg your pardon, or lack thereof?
There were bright spots. If you look at what states have been able to do with regards to investment in health and education, surprisingly, about 9 states were able to exceed the UNESCO recommendation of investing at least 20% of their budgets in education. And that's something that has never happened. But how that would now translate, into better educational outcomes, into a reduction in the number of out-of-school children, into the quality of education on ground, are things that we now need to monitor across board. But in terms of, seeing states put their money in these sectors, as the case may be, we've seen improvement year on year from what has been, happening in the past. Same with investments in health. Just two states, were able to surpass the Abuja declaration of investing 15% of your annual budgets on health. But also with the remarks I made with regards to investment in the educational sector, until this translates into your reduction in under 5 mortality, which is currently, at a rate where 1 in every 10 children born in Nigeria, as at 2021 when the study was done, die before they reach the age of 5. Same with vaccination coverage across board. Same with health insurance coverage. Only 2.8% of women in Nigeria at the moment have any health insurance coverage whatsoever. And so until we begin to see how these investments from their financial statements translate into improved living conditions, improved health outcomes, for Nigerians across board, that's when we can, really pat them on the back and say that they have really done well. But on the face of the numbers, it's commendable to see that states are, beginning to be more deliberate about investing a sizable chunk of their budgets in these 2 really critical social sectors.
All right, so finally, Iniobong, some might ask if it's even fair to put states on the same pedestal, or at least measure them by the same metrics as this report has done, Because we've seen that there are states that seem to be way ahead of others and some states playing catch up in regards to their economy and making sure that they're on a sure footing. So when it comes to looking at the peculiarities of each state and the path that they have to trend, are we on the right path by having these same metrics? I know this is a conversation that has existed from time immemorial with Nigeria. Let's go back to the regional. Let's not look at this in terms of states. Let's all of that conversation. So is it really fair in the long run to have all of these 36 states being held up to the same standards?
I mean, we found a way to sort of create equal footing for all of the states. And you would see that for a state like Lagos that generates, a large chunk of IGR, you would see that in the last 3 years, they didn't come first. And you would see that some states too that have, recorded very minimal IGR compared to their population that they are able to come up. So it tells you that for the methodology we use, we try to create that balance across board. And I mean, I didn't speak to the methodology in the beginning, but maybe it's something I should quickly speak to. So there are about 5 indexes. The first index tries to see how states would theoretically be able to meet their operating expenses with what they're able to generate with their IGR. The second, which looks at the growth in IGR year on year, not the quantum of the IGR. So it's possible that a state that generated 6 billion last year and was able to generate 12 billion this year would rank higher on that index than a state like Lagos that moved from, let me say, 400 billion to a 430 billion. Because what you are looking at is the year-on-year growth. The index B is trying to see how states are able to meet their operating expenses and loan repayment obligations with their total revenue. The C, is a composite index for debt sustainability. And the last index, tries to identify states that are prioritizing investments in capital projects or expenditure, as the case may be, over their recurrent obligations. And so when you merge all of this together and give it the right weights, you would see that you are able to really see states that are making considerable progress in each of those indicators across board.
All right, Iniobong Usen, Head Research and Policy Advisory for BudgIT. Thank you so much for joining me. When we get to the part of compiling how some states are doing better and what the lessons are, I know we'll have that conversation to make sure it's spread across board. But as for now, final question, one, just very simple. I don't know if I'm going to be able to block you into the corner. Do you have concerns about the viability of overall the majority of Nigerian states? It's a yes or no.
Yes. I mean, if you look at the fact dependence, it tells you that states really need to do more, to win themselves off that dependence on federal transfers. And
a conversation that will definitely continue. But Iniobong, thank you so much for your time. All right, guys, we have international headlines coming up next. And then, of course, we'll be looking at the African Sustainability Risk Index and looking at what the conversation is for economies across the continent. Do stay with us. You're watching Business Edge.